Imagine, just for a second, that you are the ruler of an ancient empire.
Right, a really massive one.
Exactly. You're sitting in a palace, and your domain stretches across, I don't know, 1,000,000 square miles.
And you have borders that are just constantly rubbing up against hostile neighboring kingdoms.
Yeah, and you have these massive agricultural zones that need to be taxed. They need to be managed.
You got supply lines, trade routes, a military that needs to be fed.
And paid.
Yeah.
And deployed. Now, imagine trying to manage literally all of that without the internet.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Without telegraphs, without, a satellite network. The sheer physical friction of just moving information across a mountain range or like a desert is staggering.
It is. I
Yeah.
mean, a whole province could go into full rebellion, and you wouldn't even know about it until, 3 weeks later?
Right, when some half-dead courier finally reaches your gates.
Yeah, the hardest problem in the ancient world wasn't actually building monuments, it was data.
Data,
Right.
exactly. It was the absolute logistical nightmare of moving, processing, and acting on information at scale.
Which is really the defining bottleneck of every early civilization.
Yeah.
And because it was so impossibly difficult, when ancient populations saw a state that actually managed to do it seamlessly.
Like a state that seemed to just know everything.
Right. See everything, move with perfect coordination. They didn't have the vocabulary of systems engineering.
So what do?
They described it as magic.
Which is exactly why, when most people hear the ancient accounts of King Solomon, they immediately default to, well, a fairy tale.
A total fantasy.
Yeah, you hear that Solomon commanded humans, jinn, and birds. And instantly, your brain just conjures up a wizard king.
Right, sitting on a flying carpet.
Exactly. With supernatural genies made of smokeless fire granting wishes, and literal birds carrying little parchment scrolls in their beaks.
It's the ultimate fantasy epic. I mean, we've been conditioned to read these texts as magical folklore.
We have. But if we strip away the centuries of mythological sentimentality that have crusted over these narratives, a completely different reality emerges.
A much more terrifyingly impressive reality, honestly.
Yeah. Because if you ask yourself what a massive state actually requires to function, you realize it doesn't need magic.
No, magic is a lazy explanation.
Right. What a state actually needs is a ruthless, uncompromising intelligence network.
It needs hard data. Data on terrain, on economic resources, on the shifting alliances of nomadic tribes.
And it requires a communications infrastructure capable of basically outpacing its adversaries.
Exactly. And this is exactly where we are going today. It's going to completely rewire how you understand ancient history.
Oh, absolutely. So we're doing a deep dive into a foundational text today.
Okay.
Surah 27 of the Quran, also known as An-Naml.
Specifically verses 10 through 17.
Right. But we aren't reading it like a book of spells. We are analyzing it through the sociological lens of G.A. Parwez.
Yeah, Parwez was a 20th century thinker who basically acted like a forensic systems analyst for ancient texts.
I love that description. A forensic analyst.
Yeah, he stripped away the folklore to look at the structural blueprints underneath.
Mm-hmm.
And his conclusion about Solomon is just staggering.
He argues that this text isn't describing a miracle worker at all, right?
Not even a little bit. He says it is describing the architect of the most sophisticated, multi-domain information state in antiquity.
And that is the crucial pivot for this whole deep dive. Because Parwez forces us to look at verses 15 through 17, where the text explicitly states that David and Solomon were given ilm.
Right. Ilm translates to knowledge.
Not magic.
No, it doesn't mean divine fire. It doesn't mean a magical wand. And it definitely doesn't mean supernatural control over the elements.
So what does it mean in this systems context?
It means the systematic capacity to gather, process, and deploy information. The Quran is encoding a reality where Solomon's supremacy was entirely organizational.
Wow. It's the difference between like relying on a supernatural cheat code and actually building an intricate heavy-duty machine.
Exactly.
And what I find so fascinating about how this text is structured is that before it shows you the perfect machine Solomon's information state, it first forces you to look at a machine that is completely failing.
It sets up this brilliant contrast.
Right. Right before we get to Solomon, verses 10 through 14, walk us through Pharaoh's empire.
Where Moses goes up against Pharaoh.
Yeah, and if Solomon represents the ultimate information processing state, Pharaoh represents the ultimate anti-information state.
The juxtaposition there is brilliant, and it is entirely deliberate. You really cannot understand the necessity of Solomon's system until you understand the catastrophic danger of Pharaoh's system.
So let's look at that. Moses brings what the text calls 9 signs to Pharaoh and his elite council.
Right, and again, because we've been bathed in this folklore, we hear the word signs and we immediately think of parlor tricks.
A staff turning into a snake, a hand glowing white. We view them as, like, magical duels.
But through Parwez's sociological framework, these signs are clear empirical demonstrations. They are evidentiary challenges.
Moses is presenting rational arguments and data.
Exactly. Data that highlights the fatal flaws in Pharaoh's socioeconomic model.
He's essentially laying down an audit, like he's bringing the receipts.
He really is. And the reaction from Pharaoh's elite council, the text calls them the Mala, is just the perfect anatomy of institutional bad faith.
Yeah, verses 13 and 14 say they dismiss these evidentiary challenges as sorcery, as mere tricks.
But there is a surgical commentary attached to that dismissal. The text literally says they denied them, though their souls were certain of them, wrongfully and arrogantly.
Wait, though their souls were certain of them. That is the key to everything right there.
It is. Pharaoh's intelligence network and his council were not stupid. They processed Moses' evidence flawlessly.
The data was clear, and they comprehended it completely.
Right. They knew Moses was presenting a structurally superior paradigm. The failure of Pharaoh's state was not cognitive.
It wasn't a lack of understanding. It was an active conscious suppression. I mean, if you think about a modern corrupt megacorporation, say a fossil fuel giant in the 1970s, or a major tobacco company in the 1950s.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. Their internal scientists do the research. The data comes back stating definitively, our product is causing catastrophic harm.
And the executives read the data. They understand the data perfectly.
But they bury it. They launch a massive public relations campaign to call the data junk science.
Which is the modern equivalent of calling it sorcery or tricks.
Exactly. They don't deny the data because they are confused. They deny it because accepting it means dismantling their own profit engine.
That is exactly the dynamic at play here. The Pharaoh's board of directors, his elite council, rejects Moses' evidence because processing it correctly would require dismantling the very authority structure they rely on.
The structure that guarantees their wealth and their supremacy.
Right. Pharaoh's system is basically a toxic trinity.
A toxic trinity. Break that down.
It combines a political dictatorship with a religious theocracy, where the ruler isn't just a king, but a god whose word cannot be questioned.
Wow. Okay.
And it combines that with monopoly capitalism, where the state controls all resources and labor.
So if you acknowledge the empirical truth that Moses is bringing, that entire trinity collapses.
Yes. So the state actively destroys information to protect its own ego and power.
And when a state commits to that kind of anti-information architecture, the only way it can maintain order is through blunt force drama.
Because if you aren't governing by reality, you have to govern by terror.
Which is exactly why Pharaoh's policy was to slaughter the sons of the Israelites. He was trying to violently suppress the demographic and ideological threat.
Because his system was fundamentally incapable of processing it rationally.
That makes so much sense. Pharaoh's state is literally a machine that crushes its own population just to survive.
It is. Now, the sociological question becomes, how do you forge a leader capable of dismantling a machine that massive, that entrenched, and that brutal?
Right, because you cannot just take a charismatic rebel, hand them a crown, and expect them to succeed.
No, you have to train them. You have to put them through a rigorous psychological and systemic reprogramming.
And this brings us to Moses' exile in Midian. He flees Egypt, he escapes the urban epicenter of Pharaoh's power, and he spends years in the wilderness.
And what is he doing out there?
He's herding sheep. Now, I have to be honest, the prophet as a shepherd trope feels so common it almost borders on cliche. You see it everywhere in ancient texts.
You really do.
But if we are committing to this systems architecture lens, there has to be a functional, logistical reason for this specific training. It can't just be about, learning to be humble in nature.
Oh, it is far more pragmatic than just learning humility. The sociological utility of herding is profound.
How so?
It teaches a fundamental law of governance that is the exact opposite of Pharaoh's model. Herding forces you to manage a stubborn, complex, wayward population without resorting to slaughter.
Because if you kill a sheep every time it wanders off, you don't have a flock anymore.
Right.
You just have a pile of dead assets.
Exactly. You cannot govern a flock through extermination. You have to guide them.
You have to protect them from external predators.
You have to manage their environment, and you have to maintain the integrity of the group.
And Pharaoh's governance model was literal slaughter, killing to maintain order.
While Moses is out in the wilderness learning how to govern through discipline, careful observation, and systemic care.
He is completely unwiring the authoritarian programming he grew up witnessing in the halls of Egypt's elite.
He is learning the mechanics of preservation rather than destruction.
I see the logic there. I really do. But if we are completely stripping away the magic and reading this like a rational blueprint, what do we do with the specific symbols of his confrontation with Pharaoh?
Like what?
The staff turning into a snake. Even Parwez's sociological reading has to account for that imagery.
It does.
And there's another detail that always stood out to me. The text notes that when Moses is commanded to confront Pharaoh, he feels fear. The Arabic word used is khawf. If he has been through this rigorous systems training, if he has the empirical truth on his side, why is he afraid? Shouldn't the ultimate systems disruptor be fearless?
Okay, let's decode the symbols first because they actually answer your question about the fear. The snake, or ajdaha, as it's often referred to in the commentaries Parwez analyzes, is not a literal reptile slithering on the marble floor of the palace.
So what is it?
The snake is a metaphor for the terrifying, deceptive, and highly visible political machinery of Pharaoh's state.
Oh, wow.
It represents the venomous bureaucracy, the sprawling military might, and the insidious propaganda network that can just strike down any dissenter in an instant.
So when Moses is told to throw down his staff,
his staff represents his unyielding reliance on the law of evidence. It is the new rational manifesto.
okay,
He's being assured that his evidence-based paradigm, his reliance on ilm, is structurally superior, and it will ultimately consume the illusions, the systemic lies, and the propaganda of Pharaoh's state.
the truth will literally devour the falsehood.
The truth devours the falsehood.
Exactly.
And that explains the fear, the khawf. Because if the snake is actually the entire Egyptian military-industrial complex...
Any rational person would be terrified.
Exactly. The linguistic distinction here is really vital.
Right, because in Arabic, there are different words for fear.
Yeah.
There is huzn, which is more akin to like internal grief, anxiety, or sorrow about the past or abstract concepts.
But this isn't abstract.
No. Then there's khawf. Khawf is the fear of a visible, tangible, immediate physical threat.
Moses' fear is not a phobia of reptiles.
No. It is the perfectly rational psychological weight of a single, formerly exiled man standing before a massive, heavily armed, utterly ruthless empire.
He is looking at the state apparatus, the snake, and recognizing its absolute lethality.
Yes.
He's not having a panic attack about a garden snake. He's a whistleblower walking into the headquarters of a totalitarian regime, knowing they execute people for fun. That is the exact scenario. He is told not to fear, not because the danger isn't real, it is incredibly real, but because his foundation, the evidence, is mathematically and structurally destined to outlast their propaganda.
So Moses basically acts as the ultimate disruptor. He shatters the anti-information state.
Right, he breaks the system of institutional bad faith.
But destroying a corrupt system is really only half the battle. You then have to build something better to replace it.
And this is where the text immediately pivots to the construction of the ideal model.
We move from the destroyer of the corrupt system, Moses, to the architects of the perfect system, David and Solomon. They are introduced right after in verse 15.
And the phrasing of verse 15 is incredibly precise.
Let's hear it.
It states, "And we gave David and Solomon knowledge," and they said, "Praise to God who has preferred us over many of his believing servants."
Now, if we are not disciplined in our reading, it is very easy to slip back into the folklore mentality here.
Oh, absolutely.
It is easy to read that and think, divine favoritism. God just liked them better and handed them a cosmic lottery ticket.
Right. It sounds like, thanks for the magic power, sorry to the rest of you peasants.
Exactly. Which completely undercuts the whole idea of a rational system that we just established.
It does. And our source material is adamant that this is not a claim to supernatural privilege. It is instead a profound acknowledgement of what is called the law of requital, or mukafat hi'amal.
Let's break down mukafat iamal, because that
Right.
feels like a central pillar to all of this.
It really is. It is the principle of strict cause and effect in the moral, social, and political universe.
The cause and effect.
Yes. It means that actions have inevitable, proportional consequences. The capacity to govern rationally is a natural consequence of operating within a rational order.
So when Solomon and David offer praise,
They are not thanking a deity for an arbitrary, unearned gift. They are recognizing that their advanced capacity emerged directly from their strict engagement with rational principles.
the law of requital dictates that the community that builds its governance on ilm, on evidence, on data, on the integrated deployment of information channels, naturally produces the conditions for a stable, just, and immensely powerful society.
Exactly.
So when they say they were preferred over many of his believing servants, it's not arbitrary favoritism. It's an acknowledgement of that cause and effect.
Right.
Like, if two societies exist, and one builds its infrastructure on superstition and ego, and the other builds it on rigorous data analysis and institutional accountability, the second society is going to rise above the first.
It's an inevitable mathematical outcome of the systems they chose to build. The differentiation is not divine nepotism.
Well, let's talk about nepotism, actually. Because verse 16 explicitly says that Solomon inherited from David and was given of all things.
Okay, yeah.
In our modern context, when we hear about someone inheriting a kingdom, we immediately think of incompetent heirs.
The classic fail son.
Exactly. A brilliant king builds an empire, dies, and hands it to his son, who has no idea how to run it but gets to be in charge just because of his bloodline.
Right.
If this is a rational, highly complex information state, how does it survive being just handed down to a kid?
Well, Parwez dismantles the traditional understanding of inheritance in this context entirely.
Oh, really?
Yeah. In a highly sophisticated information state, inheritance cannot simply mean succeeding to a throne through biological lineage. It means succeeding in capacity.
Succeeding in capacity.
Think about the scale of the system we are describing here. If a state requires extreme competence, logistical mastery, and data analysis just to run,
An incompetent son simply cannot inherit its true function. The state would instantly fracture.
exactly.
It's like inheriting a nuclear power plant.
That is a phenomenal analogy.
Right. Just because your name is on the deed doesn't mean you can walk into the control room and start pressing buttons.
You will cause a meltdown.
You have to inherit the operating manual, the years of physics training, the systemic understanding of how the rods work.
Yes. Solomon didn't just inherit a crown. He inherited the rigorous qualifications, the systems-level thinking, and the heavy, grueling responsibilities of governance.
He inherited the ilm.
He was trained to operate the nuclear power plant of antiquity, and when the text says he was given of all things, it is not describing a magical inventory of spells.
So what are the all things?
It is describing physical and organizational infrastructure. It means having access to the vast socioeconomic resources, the military logistics, the agricultural output, and the technological tools required to run a state at scale.
He was handed the keys to a fully equipped, perfectly resourced apparatus.
He was. And what an apparatus it was.
Yeah, which brings us to verse 17. And this is the absolute core of the folklore myth.
It really is.
If Solomon wasn't using magic, what did this massive rational infrastructure actually look like on the ground? Verse 17 lists Solomon's forces.
It says his hosts were gathered together, the Ins, the Jinn, and the Ter, humans, jinn, and birds.
And this is where Parvez's linguistic deep dive changes absolutely everything.
We have to systematically break down these three Arabic terms and look at their root meanings.
Completely stripping away the supernatural gloss.
Right, the gloss that was plastered over them centuries later by commentators who just couldn't fathom the logistics involved.
So let's start with the first division of Solomon's force array. Alans.
Humans.
Yes, but specifically it refers to the visible, formal, institutional actors.
Right, this is the regular, mapped-out state apparatus.
It's the urban citizens, the regular infantry, the formal bureaucracy, the tax collectors, basically the visible face of the government.
When you walk into the capital city, the Ins is the machinery you can see and interact with.
Okay, that's the easy one. That makes perfect sense for any ancient or modern state. But then we get to Al-Jinn. And for anyone who knows the folklore, jinn are genies. They are spirits of smokeless fire. They possess people. They grant wishes. How does that map onto a rational systems architecture?
It maps perfectly once you look at the Arabic root. Our source text explicitly rejects the idea of ghosts, goblins, or supernatural spirits in this context entirely.
So what does the root word actually mean?
The root of the word jinn implies something that is hidden, concealed, or operating out of direct sight.
Oh, okay, so if we are analyzing a massive state apparatus, who are the hidden forces?
It's the covert architecture.
Right?
It's the non-visible but highly active and incredibly potent forces that every sophisticated state relies on. Parwez argues this refers to nomadic mountain tribes that operate outside the formal urban centers.
Covert intelligence operators.
Unmapped economic currents, black market regulators.
And just the unseen architecture of power that a state utilizes but doesn't exactly parade in the capital square.
Exactly.
So if INS is the visible formal state, like the uniformed police, the DMV, the regular army, then JIN represents the covert state.
It's the special operations teams embedded in hostile territory.
It's the dark money pools funding proxy conflicts.
Yes, it's the tribal alliances in the mountains that aren't officially on the books, but act as a crucial buffer against invaders.
That makes so much sense. A state cannot survive purely on its visible institutions. It needs a robust, concealed apparatus to handle the friction on the edges of its empire.
Now we move to the third division, Altair.
The birds.
Again, folklore says literal birds. Pigeons with scrolls, eagles doing reconnaissance.
Right. But we know it's not that.
Look at the root function of the word. It relates to flying, hovering, or moving incredibly swiftly over terrain.
Okay.
In the context of a military and logistical array, these are the fast-moving elements of the state.
This is the cavalry.
The high-speed courier networks, the reconnaissance infrastructure that moves intelligence across vast distances rapidly.
They are the eyes and ears that dart across the empire, bypassing the slow, plodding movements of the regular infantry.
Exactly.
If we synthesize this, the parallels to a modern superpower are staggering.
They really are.
The ins is your regular standing army and your sprawling civil service bureaucracy. The jin is your CIA, your cyber warfare divisions, your deep cover operatives.
And the terror is your satellite network, your drone reconnaissance, your high-speed fiber optic intelligence sharing.
What the Quran is describing in verse 17 is literally a fully integrated, multi-domain military and intelligence apparatus.
It is a blueprint for total situational awareness.
Wow.
But having those three disparate, massive forces is incredibly dangerous if they aren't synchronized.
Oh, for sure.
And the text provides a very specific word to describe how Solomon managed these three divisions.
Yuza'un.
Yuza'on. What is the exact mechanical implication of that word?
It means they are arrayed, mathematically distributed, and kept in strict, unyielding check. It is hardcore military logistical language.
Mathematically distributed.
Yeah. The root implies a distributor or a strict chain of command that prevents the vanguard from outpacing the rearguard.
It's supply chain management. It is extreme supply chain management. Think about the physical reality of it. If your fast reconnaissance moves too far ahead and engages an enemy, but your slow-moving regular infantry is a week behind.
Your reconnaissance gets wiped out.
Exactly. Or if your covert tribal networks start acting independently without oversight from the central bureaucracy.
You get an internal rebellion.
Right. Yuzo means there was a central nervous system coordinating the exact speed, placement, and integration of millions of moving parts.
Without that strict structural discipline, this massive apparatus wouldn't be an empire. It would be a chaotic, self-destructing mob.
It would.
I mean, if you've ever tracked a package online, you know the complexity of modern logistics.
Right.
A package moves from a factory to a container ship to a rail yard to a warehouse to a delivery van. Amazon spends billions of dollars just to coordinate the transfer points so things don't pile up or get lost.
And Solomon was executing that level of logistical orchestration using with human beings, covert networks, and fast cavalry across mountains and deserts.
That is mind-bending.
It is. But here is the ultimate bottleneck.
There's a bottleneck.
Oh, yeah. Having the drones, the spies, and the regular army seamlessly integrated is totally useless if the leadership at the top cannot process the data they are bringing back.
Right. You can have 1,000 couriers arriving at the palace every hour, but if you can't read the reports, your empire is deaf and blind.
Which brings us to verse 16, and the phrase that is arguably the most famous piece of Solomon folklore.
We have been taught the speech of birds, manticultere.
Yes, the phrase that cemented the idea that Solomon was Dr. Dolittle talking to animals.
But if we follow our structural logic, if the kikulteres aren't literal birds, but the fast courier and reconnaissance network, then manticultere cannot be animal language.
Precisely. Manticultere is the highly specialized capacity to decode the information carried by that intelligence network.
It is signals intelligence.
Think of it this way. A courier rides in from a border province. He doesn't just hand Solomon a plain text letter that anyone could read if the courier was intercepted.
No, he brings encrypted data, coded signals, or specialized military shorthand.
Manticultere is the analytical framework required to interpret those complex reconnaissance reports.
It's data analysis. It's the ability to filter out the noise.
Right.
Like, if a modern general looks at a raw, static-filled satellite feed, it might just look like blurry pixels. But a trained intelligence analyst looks at those same pixels and says, no, that's not static. That's the thermal exhaust of a tank battalion moving into an attack formation.
The analyst has the mantic. They speak the language of the data.
That is brilliant.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the ilm, the knowledge we discussed at the very beginning. Data without an analytical framework is just noise.
Solomon's system was defined by its unparalleled capacity to decode the signals of the geopolitical environment.
And this capacity is put to the test immediately in the narrative. The text doesn't just tell us he has this great system, it demonstrates it in action.
Which brings us to verse 18, the encounter with the ant.
The Valley of the Ants.
Right. According to the traditional folklore, Solomon is marching his massive army, and he suddenly calls a halt because he hears a literal tiny insect yelling at its fellow ants to get out of the way.
And Parwez's source notes dismantle this beautifully.
I can imagine.
This isn't a literal talking insect. An-Naml is the Arabic word for ant, yes, but in this historical and sociological context, it is the name of a specific tribe.
The tribe of An-Naml.
The ants. It was a weaker, smaller, marginalized population residing in a specific valley.
Okay.
The text tells us that as Solomon's massive multi-domain force array approaches, the leader of the An-Naml tribe warns their people. They say, essentially, take cover, hide in your dwellings, lest Solomon and his hosts crush you unawares.
Which makes perfect, terrifying sense. I mean, if you have an army of 100,000 soldiers, horses, and supply wagons marching through a narrow valley, a small tribal village is going to get absolutely obliterated just by the footprint of the logistics.
Exactly. It's not even malice. It's just the sheer mass of the empire moving.
But why does the text bother including this detail? We just spent all this time establishing this grand, terrifyingly efficient military machine. Why pause the grand narrative to focus on a tiny, vulnerable tribe scrambling to get out of the way?
What does this prove about Solomon's state?
Right?
It proves the system's ultimate precision, and it brings us full circle back to the contrast with Pharaoh.
Oh, the contrast. Okay, think about Pharaoh's system. It crushed weak populations blindly.
It used blunt force to exterminate the Israelites. It was a massive machine, but it was dumb.
It couldn't process nuance. It could only destroy.
And Solomon's system is the exact opposite.
Because it actually hears the warning.
Yes. The system is so perfectly designed, and its information processing, its mantic altair, is so acute that it picks up the localized distress signals of a marginalized tribe.
A lesser army would have marched right over the An-Naml without even noticing they were there.
But Solomon's intelligence network is granular. It processes micro-level data. The warning of the weak is heard, decoded, and acted upon by the highest levels of leadership.
That completely redefines what makes a superpower advanced.
It really does.
True sophistication isn't just the ability to project massive force and conquer territory. Any blunt instrument can do that.
Right. True sophistication is the ability to move a massive apparatus without causing collateral damage.
It's the ability to filter data so precisely that you could step around the vulnerable rather than crushing them.
Exactly. The narrative of the Ant Valley is the ultimate proof of concept for the ilm. It proves that the intelligence network isn't just used for war, it is used for profound administrative justice.
The state protects the weak precisely because it has the data processing capability to see them.
Yes.
So as we pull all these massive threads together, what we are really looking at in Surah 27 is a masterclass in civilizational survival.
It is. The text is presenting two fundamentally opposing architectural models for a state.
On one side, you have the model of Pharaoh. It is a system that actively suppresses empirical data because the truth threatens the elite power structures.
It relies on the Mala, the corrupt board of directors who deny reality to protect their wealth.
It governs through terror. It silences whistleblowers like Moses, and it ultimately marches blindly into its own ruin.
Because an anti-information state cannot survive contact with reality.
And on the other side, you have the counter model, Solomon's model.
A system architecturally built from the ground up to receive, decode, and act on information from every conceivable layer of the environment.
It integrates the visible institutions, the hidden economic and covert forces, and the high-speed reconnaissance networks.
And it governs through mantic altair, the rigorous analytical decoding of reality.
And if we step back and view this sociologically, it highlights a profound difference between permanent principles and temporary tools.
Absolutely. The tools of governance are always changing. In Solomon's era, the absolute cutting edge of information technology was horse couriers, covert tribal alliances, and rigorous physical logistical arrays.
Today, the tools are completely different. The modern terror is a network of low Earth orbit satellites.
The modern Jinn is a cyber warfare unit utilizing zero-day exploits.
The modern mantic altair is an artificial intelligence processing millions of data points a second.
But the principle hasn't changed at all.
Not one bit. The Surah is not nostalgic for the ancient tools of Solomon. It doesn't want us to go back to riding horses.
No, it is encoding a permanent mathematical principle of sociology. The strength, stability, and survival of any governance system is a direct function of the quality, reach, and integrity of its information processing architecture.
The states that embrace reality and build systems to decode it thrive. The states that suppress reality to protect elite egos collapse.
That is the ultimate takeaway.
That is just phenomenal. It takes a story that I've known my whole life as a fairy tale about a guy talking to birds and turns it into a master-level thesis on the logistics of power.
It makes you realize that the ancient world wasn't full of magicians. It was full of engineers trying to solve the exact same massive problems of human organization that we are trying to solve today.
And here is a final provocative thought for you to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. If Solomon's magic was actually just highly advanced organizational, military, and intelligence infrastructure that the average peasant simply didn't understand,
What modern magical black boxes are we currently treating with blind superstition?
think about the algorithms that dictate global financial markets. Think about artificial intelligence models that process our data, or the mass surveillance architectures operating quietly in the background of our digital lives.
To most of us, they operate completely out of sight. They are our modern jinn.
We don't understand the math, so we treat them with this weird mix of awe and terror, almost like we are awestruck villagers marveling at wizardry.
Are we making the exact same mistake the ancients did?
Because maybe it's time we stop looking for magic, stop accepting the fairy tales we are told about how the world works, and start analyzing the actual architecture of power, data, and control that is operating right in front of us.